George Washington. In the fall of 1794, President George Washington faced a crisis that threatened the very foundations of the young United States. It was the first true test of federal authority, the Whiskey Rebellion. This revolt took place in the western frontier of Pennsylvania, where farmers and distillers, frustrated by a new federal tax on whiskey, rose up in protest. The tax was part of Washington's plan to stabilize the nation's finances, but it quickly became a symbol of federal overreach. Tensions boiled over in July, when a mob attacked tax collectors. By the fall, the rebellion had grown, with hundreds of insurgents ready to fight. Washington, reluctant yet resolute, knew that if he didn't act, the government's authority would be undermined. In October, he made the unprecedented decision to personally lead 13,000 militia troops to suppress the revolt. Despite the overwhelming show of force, the resistance crumbled with minimal bloodshed, only a few fatalities. Yet his decision to send troops into his own country, against his fellow citizens, was a dark moment in his presidency. John Adams. In 1798, during President John Adams's administration, the United States faced a crisis of civil liberties. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, a series of laws that granted the government unprecedented powers. These acts allowed the president to deport foreigners and criminalized any criticism of the government. Fearing French influence and internal dissent amid rising tensions with France, Adams believed these laws were necessary for national security. However, the result was a wave of backlash. Protesters denounced the acts as a direct attack on free speech, and even some of Adams' allies turned against him. The controversy over these laws marred Adams' presidency, staining his legacy and contributing to his loss in the 1800 election. Thomas Jefferson. On December 22, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, facing mounting pressure from both Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars, enacted the Embargo Act, a sweeping ban on international trade aimed at punishing the two European powers. The goal was simple: force Britain and France to respect U.S. neutrality by crippling their economy. But what seemed like a strategic move soon turned disastrous. With ports shut down and ships docked, the U.S. economy faltered, and the American people bore the brunt of the decision. Farmers saw their crops rot, and merchants faced ruin as their businesses collapsed. No lives were lost in a traditional sense, but the nation's economy and Jefferson's political career suffered a severe blow. James Madison. On August 24, 1814, President James Madison faced one of the most humiliating days in American history. Amid the War of 1812, British forces marched through Washington, D.C., torching the White House and the U.S. Capitol. The cause? The ongoing conflict with Britain, fueled by trade restrictions and British support for Native American attacks on American settlers. As the British Army advanced, chaos unfolded in the nation's capital. The president and his wife, Dolly Madison, fled the White House just hours before it was set ablaze. The Capitol, housing the nation's legislative power, was also engulfed in flames. While there were few direct fatalities, the psychological toll was profound. A young republic, proud and newly independent, was struck at its very heart. The British left the city in ruins, having successfully humiliated the United States on its own soil. James Monroe. In 1819, President James Monroe faced the first major financial crisis in U.S. history. The Panic of 1819 struck like a thunderclap, shattering the nation's fragile economy. Triggered by the collapse of land speculation, a sudden tightening of credit by the Bank of the United States, and a sharp drop in the prices of cotton and other commodities, the crisis plunged the country into a deep recession. The economic fallout was devastating. Businesses went bankrupt, unemployment soared, and widespread poverty gripped many Americans. The once celebrated era of good feelings, a period marked by political harmony, suddenly seemed like a distant memory. With banks failing, farmers losing their land, and public disillusionment rising, Monroe's presidency was put to the test. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much. John Quincy Adams. On October 31, 1828, John Quincy Adams faced one of the most crushing defeats of his career: the U.S. presidential election. In a bitter contest, Adams, the incumbent president, was up against Andrew Jackson, a populist general with widespread support. The election was marked by fierce rivalry and personal attacks. Jackson's supporters accused Adams of securing the presidency in 1824 through a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay, who had allegedly brokered a deal in exchange for a cabinet position. The allegations stuck, staining Adams's reputation. As the votes rolled in, Jackson emerged victorious, securing 178 electoral votes to Adams's 83, a resounding rejection of his leadership. Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States, is often remembered for his controversial policies and the impact they had on American history. In the 1830s, one of the darkest chapters of his presidency unfolded: the Indian Removal Act. Signed into law in 1830, this policy forced thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands, an event that would become known as the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act was designed to open up land for white settlers in the southeastern United States. Jackson believed that the Native American tribes were hindering economic progress. The result? The forced relocation of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes, among others. The journey, which took place over several years, was brutal. Thousands of Native Americans died from disease, hunger, and exhaustion, with estimates of fatalities ranging from 2,000 to 8,000. Martin Van Buren. On May 8, 1837, President Martin Van Buren faced the darkest moment of his presidency. The United States had just plunged into an economic disaster, the Panic of 1837. The collapse was marked by widespread bank failures, mass unemployment, and a banking crisis that left Americans in financial ruin. The cause? Overspeculation in land, reckless banking practices, and Van Buren's decision to dismantle the Bank of the United States, which had once stabilized the nation's economy. As the economy teetered, the effects were swift and brutal. Banks shut their doors, workers lost their jobs, and panic spread like wildfire. No fatalities were directly attributed to the economic downfall, but the human toll was undeniable. The U.S. fell into a deep depression that lasted for years, and Van Buren found himself blamed for the crisis, even though it had roots in policies and circumstances far beyond his control. The outcome was devastating for Van Buren's political career. The public's trust in him was shattered, leading to his failure to win re-election in 1840. William Henry Harrison. On March 4, 1841, William Henry Harrison became the 9th President of the United States. Just 1 month later, on April 4, 1841, he died, making his presidency the shortest in U.S. history. Harrison's inauguration took place on a cold, rainy day, and despite the weather, he delivered a long, vigorous speech, exposing himself to the elements. Within days, he fell ill with a fever, which quickly developed into pneumonia. Despite efforts to save him, Harrison's health continued to decline. His death, just 31 days into his term, shocked the nation and left the country grappling with an unforeseen presidential crisis. John Tyler. The 10th President of the United States found himself in an incredibly turbulent political storm during his time in office. Taking over after the sudden death of William Henry Harrison on April 4, 1841, Tyler was immediately thrown into the role of president, but it wasn't the smooth transition one might expect. His presidency was marked by intense turmoil, largely due to his support for the annexation of Texas, a highly controversial issue that divided the nation. Tyler's stance on Texas infuriated both his own Whig Party and the opposition Democrats. The Whigs, who had originally elevated him to vice president, quickly turned on him, expelling him from the party by September 1841. This betrayal left him isolated in a hostile Congress, where he faced constant resistance. His political battles reached a fever pitch when Congress rejected his plan to annex Texas, pushing him to take executive action in his final days in office. By the time Tyler left office in 1845, his legacy was one of deep controversy. Though he secured Texas's annexation in the end, he was never truly embraced by any political faction. earning the nickname his accidency. James K. Polk. On May 13, 1846, President James K. Polk found himself leading the nation into one of the most contentious conflicts in U.S. history, the Mexican-American War. Polk, determined to expand the United States borders, sought to annex Texas and secure California and the Southwest, pushing the nation to the brink of war with Mexico. The U.S. Army advanced into disputed territory along the Rio Grande, triggering violent clashes. While the U.S. achieved military victory, capturing vast territories, the war was deeply divisive. Critics labeled it an imperialist land grab, accusing Polk of provoking the conflict for the sake of territorial expansion, particularly to bolster slavery in the new states. Throughout the war, thousands of lives were lost, both military and civilian, as troops marched into Mexico, with battles like Buena Vista and Chapultepec shaping its outcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I've got lots of interesting videos coming up on the channel. Zachary Taylor. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor found himself at the center of a nation torn apart by the issue of slavery. Taylor, who had only taken office in March of that year, faced intense sectional tensions as debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories threatened to tear the Union apart. The country was on the brink of a civil war, with the southern states demanding the extension of slavery into newly acquired territories, while northern states were pushing for its abolition. Tragically, just months into his presidency, Taylor died suddenly on July 9, 1850, after falling ill from what was later believed to be acute gastroenteritis. His unexpected death occurred at a moment of intense crisis, leaving the nation in shock. Millard Fillmore. The 13th President of the United States found himself at the center of a nation divided. On September 18, 1850, he signed the Fugitive Slave Act, a decision that would haunt his legacy. The law required citizens to aid in the capture and return of runaway slaves, infuriating abolitionists and pushing the nation closer to civil war. The act intensified the already growing tension between the North and South, as it forced many in the North, who had been fighting for abolition, to confront the reality of their complicity in slavery. Fillmore believed the law was a necessary compromise to preserve the Union, but it came at a grave cost. The enforcement of the act led to the capture of numerous freedmen, sending shockwaves through communities that had hoped for a more just future. Franklin Pierce. On May 30, 1854, President Franklin Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that divided the Nebraska Territory into two, Kansas and Nebraska, and left the question of slavery to the will of the settlers. His decision, made in the wake of rising tensions over slavery, set the stage for one of the most violent chapters in American history, Bleeding Kansas. The act allowed settlers to decide whether to permit slavery, inciting brutal conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. Violence erupted in Kansas, where both sides flooded the region in an attempt to sway the vote. From 1854 to 1856, a series of bloody clashes left dozens dead and hundreds wounded. The violence was not just confined to skirmishes, but spread through political and social upheaval. The pro-slavery forces, backed by Southern sympathizers, fought fiercely against abolitionists, who were determined to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state. James Buchanan. The 15th President of the United States stood in office during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. In late 1860, as the nation teetered on the edge of civil war, Buchanan watched helplessly as Southern states began to secede from the Union, following the election of Abraham Lincoln. His indecisiveness and failure to act swiftly during this crisis would mark his presidency with controversy. By December 1860, South Carolina was the first state to secede, and by February 1861, 6 more had followed. Buchanan, believing that secession was illegal but unwilling to take decisive action to stop it, left the crisis largely unresolved. As tensions escalated, Buchanan's inaction allowed the secession movement to gain momentum, contributing directly to the eruption of the Civil War just months after he left office. The failure of Buchanan to preserve the Union or take a strong stance against the disunion left the country deeply divided, and his legacy remains stained by his perceived inability to prevent the inevitable conflict. His darkest day wasn't marked by one singular event, but by a series of missed opportunities that allowed the Union to crumble under his watch. Abraham Lincoln. On April 14, 1865, just days after the Union's victory in the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln faced the darkest day of his life, and the nation's. The scene was Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., where Lincoln sat, enjoying a night out with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. The mood was celebratory, yet history had other plans. At around 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, silently crept behind the president, raised a pistol, and fired. The shot rang out, striking Lincoln in the back of the head. He slumped forward, mortally wounded. Booth, a well-known actor and fanatic, escaped into the night, igniting a nationwide manhunt. Lincoln was rushed across the street to the Peterson House, where doctors did everything they could. But by 7:22 a.m. the following morning, on April 15, Lincoln was declared dead. His assassination was not just the loss of a leader, it was the devastating blow to a nation beginning to heal from its Civil War wounds. Andrew Johnson. On March 2, 1868, Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, faced the darkest day of his presidency. As the nation struggled with the aftermath of the Civil War, Johnson's tumultuous relationship with Congress pushed him to the brink. The conflict reached its peak when the House of Representatives voted to impeach him, accusing him of violating the Tenure of Office Act by removing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and attempting to replace him without Senate approval. The stage was set for an unprecedented event in U.S. history. The impeachment trial that followed was a dramatic showdown, with Johnson becoming the first sitting president ever to face impeachment, Ulysses S. Grant. The 18th President of the United States faced one of the darkest moments of his presidency on May 10, 1875, when the whiskey ring scandal erupted. The scandal exposed a massive network of corruption within his administration, involving high-ranking officials and government agents who conspired to defraud the U.S. Treasury of millions of dollars. These officials allowed whiskey distillers to avoid paying taxes, while the distillers bribed government agents to cover up the fraud. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that members of Grant's inner circle were deeply involved, shaking the public's trust in his administration. Though no fatalities were reported, the scandal caused significant political damage. Grant's reputation for honesty, earned during his military career, was severely tarnished. Despite his initial denial of involvement, the revelations were impossible to ignore. Ultimately, 110 people were indicted, and the scandal would haunt Grant's second term. Rutherford B. Hayes. On March 2, 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the 19th President of the United States, but the price of his victory was steep. The Compromise of 1877, an agreement between Republicans and Southern Democrats, effectively ended the contested 1876 election and allowed Hayes to assume the presidency in exchange for one key concession: the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This deal marked the official end of Reconstruction, a period that had aimed to rebuild the South and protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. As a result, the South was left to govern itself, and millions of African Americans who had gained political rights were abandoned to face a resurgence of white supremacy and violence. The withdrawal of federal troops led to the collapse of Republican governments in the South, enabling the rise of Jim Crow laws. The outcome? While Hayes secured the presidency, he did so at the cost of the progress made during Reconstruction, leaving the South to fester in racial inequality for decades to come. James A. Garfield. On July 2, 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot twice in the back by Charles J. Guiteau, a disgruntled office seeker outside the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. Guiteau, who felt he was owed a government position, believed that the president's death would benefit the nation. Garfield, severely wounded, was rushed to the White House, where doctors attempted various treatments. However, their lack of sterile technique and rudimentary methods only worsened his condition. For weeks, the infection from the bullet wounds spread through his body, and on September 19, 1881, Garfield died, just 2 months after the assassination attempt. Chester A. Arthur. The 21st President of the United States faced a profound tragedy before even stepping into the White House. In 1880, just 1 year before his presidency, Arthur's wife, Ellen Lewis Herndon Arthur, passed away from pneumonia. Her death left him devastated, casting a shadow over his life and career. The loss was so deep that Arthur kept her portrait in the White House throughout his presidency and never remarried. His personal grief was rarely seen by the public, but it shaped the man behind the presidency. Despite his achievements in office, the loss of Ellen remained a poignant, unspoken part of Arthur's legacy. Benjamin Harrison. On November 25, 1892, just days before the U.S. presidential election, Benjamin Harrison faced an unimaginable personal tragedy. His beloved wife, Caroline, passed away from tuberculosis. The timing could not have been worse. Her death came at the height of his re-election campaign, and Harrison, already battling political challenges, now found himself shattered both personally and politically. Caroline had been his steady companion throughout his first term, and her loss left a gaping hole in his heart. The nation mourned alongside him, but for Harrison, the grief was overwhelming. Despite the deep sorrow, he continued to press on in the election, but the emotional toll was evident. The weight of personal loss and political pressure led to his defeat in the 1892 election, marking not only a personal heartbreak but a turning point in his political career. Grover Cleveland, the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, he returned to office in 1893 amidst a storm of economic chaos. The nation, still reeling from the lingering effects of the Panic of 1893, faced an unprecedented financial collapse. Triggered by the overexpansion of railroads, a failing banking system, and a plummeting gold reserve, the crisis led to widespread bank failures, mass unemployment, and factory closures. The unrest soon sparked a wave of labor strikes across the country, most notably the Pullman strike, which saw thousands of workers protest against wage cuts and poor working conditions. The federal government, under Cleveland's leadership, responded with military force, escalating the crisis further. As the nation struggled to recover, Cleveland's second term became marked by the scars of a financial disaster, forever altering the landscape of American labor relations and presidential power. William McKinley. On September 6, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President William McKinley's life was violently cut short. As he greeted a crowd of well-wishers, a 28-year-old anarchist named Leon Czolgosz stepped forward and shot him twice in the abdomen. The president, though initially conscious and alert, was gravely wounded. The shooting was a politically motivated attack, fueled by Czolgosz's belief that McKinley was an enemy of the working class. McKinley was rushed to the hospital, but despite initial hopes for recovery, he succumbed to gangrene caused by his wounds just 8 days later, on September 14, 1901. Theodore Roosevelt. On July 14, 1918, Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, faced a heart-wrenching tragedy that would mark one of the darkest days of his life. His youngest son, Quentin Roosevelt, a fighter pilot in World War I, was shot down in aerial combat over France. At just 20 years old, Quentin's death in the skies, far from home, shattered his father. William Howard Taft. In 1912, President William Howard Taft faced a devastating political crisis. After a bitter split with his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft found himself in a fierce battle for control of the Republican Party. The rift began when Roosevelt, dissatisfied with Taft's policies, launched a challenge for the presidency, forming the progressive Bull Moose Party. This division split the GOP and led to a catastrophic loss in the general election. Taft, once a promising figure, was left humiliated as Roosevelt's third-party campaign siphoned off crucial votes, allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. The collapse of the Republican Party in 1912 marked one of the darkest chapters in Taft's presidency, a moment that shattered his political career and forever altered the course of American politics. Woodrow Wilson. The 28th President of the United States faced one of the darkest days of his presidency on October 2, 1919, when a massive stroke left him debilitated. At the height of his term, While leading the country through post-World War I struggles and the delicate peace negotiations, Wilson's health suddenly failed him. Stricken while in the White House, he became almost entirely incapacitated, unable to fulfill his duties. His wife, Edith Wilson, stepped into a controversial role, managing his affairs and essentially running the White House while the nation was kept in the dark about the extent of his condition. Warren G. Harding. In 1923, Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, faced his darkest day, a scandal that would stain his legacy forever. The Teapot Dome scandal, which erupted during his presidency, involved his closest allies, including members of his cabinet, secretly leasing federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. The corruption was so deep that it shook the very foundation of American politics. Harding, who had come to power on a platform of honesty and integrity, was blindsided by the betrayal within his administration. He died suddenly on August 2, 1923, before the full extent of the scandal was revealed. Calvin Coolidge. On July 7, 1924, President Calvin Coolidge faced the darkest moment of his presidency when tragedy struck the White House. His beloved teenage son, Calvin Jr., was just 16 years old when he developed a blister on his foot that became infected, leading to severe blood poisoning. Despite the best efforts of doctors, the young boy's condition rapidly worsened. On the afternoon of July 7th, Calvin Jr. passed away, leaving Coolidge and his wife devastated. The president, known for his stoic demeanor, was visibly crushed by the loss. Herbert Hoover. On October 29, 1929, Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, found his presidency at the brink of collapse as Black Tuesday sent shockwaves through Wall Street. The stock market crash, a culmination of years of unsound financial practices, triggered the worst economic downturn in U.S. history, the Great Depression. Thousands of businesses collapsed and unemployment soared. Hoover, once celebrated for his humanitarian efforts, faced mounting criticism for his inability to control the crisis. The collapse wasn't just financial, it was a devastating blow to Hoover's reputation. Despite his efforts to stabilize the economy, his policies were widely seen as ineffective. Franklin D. Roosevelt. On December 7, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced one of the darkest moments in U.S. history. Early that Sunday morning, Japan launched a surprise military strike on Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. In a brutal attack that lasted just over 2 hours, nearly 3,500 Americans were killed or wounded, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet was severely crippled. The assault shattered any illusion of peace, marking a pivotal moment that thrust the United States into World War II. The next day, Roosevelt, speaking before Congress, delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, declaring war on Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor would forever change the course of history, uniting a nation and shaping the future of the world. Harry S. Truman. On August 6, 1945, President Harry S. Truman faced one of the most agonizing decisions in history. As World War II raged on, Truman authorized the deployment of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, followed by Nagasaki just 3 days later. These bombings led to an immediate death toll of over 100,000 people, with countless others suffering from the long-term effects of radiation. Truman's choice, made in a moment of desperation to end the war and save American lives, forever changed the nature of warfare. Though it ultimately brought about Japan's surrender, the devastation left behind haunted Truman for the rest of his life. Dwight D. Eisenhower. On May 1, 1960, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower faced one of the darkest days of his presidency. A U.S. U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over the Soviet Union. This high-altitude reconnaissance mission, designed to gather critical intelligence, ended in disaster when the plane was struck by a Soviet missile. Powers parachuted to safety but was quickly captured by the KGB. Powers was eventually tried and imprisoned, though he was released in a 1962 prisoner exchange. John F. Kennedy. On November 22, 1963, at 12:30 p.m., President John F. Kennedy was tragically shot while riding in a motorcade in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. The president, accompanied by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife Nellie, was waving to a cheering crowd when shots rang out. As the vehicle sped off, Kennedy was struck twice, once in the upper back and once in the head. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. The nation was thrust into a state of shock and disbelief, forever altering the course of American history. Lyndon B. Johnson. On January 30, 1968, the Vietnam War took a devastating turn for President Lyndon B. Johnson. The North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, a massive, coordinated attack on over 100 cities and military bases across South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. This surprise offensive shattered the belief that victory was near, as U.S. forces, caught off guard, faced overwhelming resistance. More than 3,000 Americans were killed, and the scale of destruction was beyond what anyone had anticipated. Richard Nixon. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, became the first commander-in-chief to resign from office. The nation watched in shock as Nixon faced inevitable impeachment over the Watergate scandal, a complex web of political espionage, cover-ups, and abuse of power. The scandal erupted when 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C., on June 17, 1972, and was later linked to the Nixon administration. The ensuing investigation revealed a pattern of deceit, wiretapping, and manipulation, leading to the discovery of the infamous White House tapes. As the pressure mounted, Nixon could no longer withstand the onslaught of public outrage and political pressure. On August 9, 1974, he officially resigned, leaving the nation shaken. Gerald Ford. On September 8, 1974, Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States, made a fateful decision that would forever mark his presidency. Just a month after Richard Nixon's resignation over the Watergate scandal, Ford granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon, sparking an intense national uproar. The pardon, intended to heal the nation's wounds, instead intensified the divide. Many saw it as a blatant act of political favor, undermining justice and accountability. Ford's approval ratings plummeted, and the backlash was felt during his re-election campaign, with some claiming it cost him the 1976 election. Jimmy Carter. On November 4, 1979, in Tehran, Iran, the U.S. Embassy was stormed by Iranian militants. 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage, marking the beginning of a crisis that would define Jimmy Carter's presidency. The militants, angered by the U.S. granting asylum to the ousted Iranian Shah, demanded his extradition in exchange for the hostages' release. Despite Carter's diplomatic efforts, the crisis intensified. Attempts to negotiate were met with resistance, and a failed rescue mission in April 1980, resulting in the deaths of 8 American servicemen, further tarnished Carter's reputation. For 444 days, the hostages endured captivity, with their ordeal becoming a symbol of America's powerlessness. Finally, on January 20, 1981, the hostages were freed, just minutes after Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Ronald Reagan. On March 30, 1981, just 69 days into his presidency, Ronald Reagan's life hung in the balance after an assassination attempt outside the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. As the 40th President of the United States stepped into a crowd, John Hinckley Jr., a 25-year-old with a twisted obsession with actress Jodie Foster, fired 6 shots. Reagan was struck in the chest, narrowly missing his heart, while 3 others, including Press Secretary James Brady, were also injured. The attack was driven by Hinckley's delusion that killing Reagan would win Foster's affection. Despite the gravity of his injuries, Reagan's resilience was remarkable. After surgery, he made a full recovery. Reagan's close brush with death reshaped his approach to security and public life. George H.W. Bush. On April 29, 1992, a nation watched in disbelief as violence erupted on the streets of Los Angeles. The verdict in the trial of 4 white police officers accused of brutally beating Rodney King, an unarmed black man, sparked a wave of fury and outrage. Despite the officers being acquitted, the verdict ignited 5 days of chaos across the city. Shops were looted, buildings burned, and innocent lives were caught in the crossfire. More than 50 people lost their lives, with thousands more injured, as rioters clashed with law enforcement. The violent unrest laid bare deep racial tensions within America, exposing the fractures between law enforcement and minority communities. By the time the National Guard restored order, the damage was immense. Bill Clinton. On January 7, 1998, President Bill Clinton, in a televised statement, publicly admitted to having an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. This revelation would plunge the nation into one of the most sensational scandals in U.S. political history. The affair led to allegations of perjury and obstruction of justice, resulting in Clinton's impeachment by the House of Representatives on December 19, 1998. The nation watched in disbelief as the president was accused of betraying both his office and the American people. Despite the gravity of the situation, Clinton was acquitted by the Senate on February 12, 1999, avoiding removal from office. George W. Bush. On September 11, 2001, at 8:46 a.m., President George W. Bush was thrust into the darkest moment of his presidency. The world watched in horror as terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. 2 were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 struck the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and the 4th, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in these coordinated attacks. As the towers collapsed, so did the illusion of invulnerability that America had once held. In the aftermath, President Bush declared a war on terror, leading to the invasion of Afghanistan and later Iraq, forever altering the course of U.S. foreign policy. The events of September 11th reshaped not only the nation's security, but the global landscape, marking a somber and defining chapter in American history. Barack Obama. On December 14, 2012, in Newtown, Connecticut, a tragedy struck that would forever change the nation. Adam Lanza, armed with semi-automatic weapons, entered Sandy Hook Elementary School and opened fire. In mere minutes, 26 lives were lost, 20 of them children, all between the ages of 6 and 7. The nation, still reeling from the shock, was gripped by grief as President Barack Obama addressed the country, his voice heavy with sorrow. Donald Trump. On January 6, 2021, a pivotal moment in U.S. history unfolded. In Washington, D.C., as Congress was set to certify Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election, thousands of Donald Trump's supporters gathered outside the U.S. Capitol. What started as a rally quickly escalated into chaos when rioters breached the Capitol building, breaking windows and overpowering police officers. As the mob stormed the halls of the legislature, 5 people lost their lives, including a Capitol police officer. The violent insurrection, fueled by unfounded claims of a stolen election, shook the very core of American democracy. The aftermath was swift. President Trump became the first president in U.S. history to face impeachment twice, this time charged with inciting the riot. Joe Biden. On August 15, 2021, as U.S. President Joe Biden oversaw the final stages of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, a chaotic and tragic event unfolded in Kabul. What was meant to be a controlled exit turned into a devastating collapse. The Taliban, swiftly advancing, captured the capital city, forcing the U.S. to rush its evacuation. This rapid fall left thousands stranded at the Kabul airport, desperate to flee the country. 13 U.S. service members lost their lives in a suicide bombing carried out by ISIS-K at the airport, adding a grim toll to the already dire situation. The world watched in horror as images of panicked civilians clinging to departing planes flooded the media. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos here. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.